So my name is Giovanna Gassage. I'm the Chief Librarian here at the United Nations Library. I'd like to thank all of you for making the time to join us today. We're very excited to have with us today Professor Rosaleen Duffy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her before we get started, and then I'm going to hand the floor over to her so she can tell us about the book, Security and Conservation, The Politics of the Illegal Wildlife Trade. So Professor Rosaleen Duffy is based at the University of Sheffield. She's a political ecologist, and her research focuses on the global politics of biodiversity conservation, especially strategies that tackle wildlife trafficking. She's author of several books, including Security and Conservation, the book we'll be talking about today. And in 2016, she was awarded a European Research Council Advanced Grant for BioSec, Biodiversity and Security, Understanding Environmental Crime, Illegal Wildlife Trade, and Threat Finance. She is currently leading the UK ESRC-funded Beastly Business Project, which examines green crime, political ecology, and illegal wildlife trade in European species. So again, a big thank you to Rosaleen for agreeing to be with us today. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And I will pass the floor over to you, Rosaleen. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk about the book, which came out in the middle of last year. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the book. I've got some slides to share, but I'm very happy to have a Q&A session afterwards. So I don't want to talk for too long because I'd like to address the questions in the audience as well. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I guess what most of us would think about if I was working on illegal wildlife trade, that it might involve some kind of journey through a rainforest or looking at looking at wildlife in some kind of spectacular national park. But actually, what I found was that I was stood outside the UK's Ministry of Defence one day, waiting to interview a person who'd been the key individual who'd started the initiative for training UK Army to work with anti-poaching teams in Malawi and Gabon. And in 2012, he had seen Prince Charles, now King Charles, talk about the need for the UK to have a really robust response to the rises in poaching of elephants and rhinos from around about 2008. And this speech in 2012 had really inspired this person from the army. And I was fascinated to learn from him as he described about how he thought his own military skills could be deployed to train anti-poaching teams across Africa. And for me, that particular meeting was really indicative of how conservation was changing, particularly in regard to the strategies used to tackle illegal wildlife trade. And it signalled this growing engagement between the conservation and security sectors that was born out of this sense of urgency as a result of the rises in poaching. So what I want to emphasise is this is at once a continuation and a shift. So it's a continuation of existing approaches in conservation which have historically used force and military tactics, but it's also a new emphasis as well. I think that there was a new emphasis on security and on illegal wildlife trade as a global security risk. And my book really explains why this integration of conservation and security happened and what the implications it has for conservation more broadly. So conservation, I think we can say, is changing, and we're accustomed to the idea that conservation might be directed by scientists who are using notebooks and running computer models, they're watching wildlife behaviours or collecting samples. But in fact, the sort of rapid growth in poaching and trafficking of some of the world's most iconic species has generated this sense of urgency that something must be done. And I think as a result, conservation and conservationists can now look very different indeed. So in some places, those notebooks and computers and sample jars have been replaced by the high-tech weapons, high-tech surveillance systems, and use of intelligence networks. And I think it's become harder and harder to distinguish between conservation and the people and practices we normally find in the security sector. So scientists are being replaced by security operatives trained in intelligence gathering, use of weapons, surveillance techniques, and the object of their gaze is not necessarily the plants and animals in the ecosystem, but the humans that might threaten them. And the couple of pictures I have up on the slide are examples of this. So one is Maisha Consulting, which is a private private security consulting company that works across several African states. And the second one is a militarized force in Nigeria, which is tackling timber trafficking in the Cross River area. So this signals a key shift, I think, and the attention from conservationists is moving away from a focus on ecological monitoring and data gathering towards a much fuller focus on people or individuals and networks who are defined as an enemy or a threat to wildlife or to states or even to global security. So the theoretical context for the book, I've got a copy of it here, so it's quite a weighty tome, I guess. But the theoretical context of the book, which I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm happy to expand on in the Q&A, is that I wanted to bring together green criminology, political ecology, and some elements of international politics from security studies debates to build this idea of a political ecology of security. And I think the sort of core argument that emerges out of that theoretical context is that when the illegal wildlife trade is defined as a security issue, it's more than just an exercise in framing or a normal response to perceived threats. It moves us on from a position of enforcement as an option of last resort, and instead enforcement becomes the option of first resort from conservation NGOs, governments, donors and international organisations. So many of you will already be familiar with this. I'll just give a quick indication of the scale of the illegal wildlife trade. It's very big business. So although the sheer scale of it is actually quite hard to estimate, what we can say is that there are two forms. So there's the legal and regulated wildlife trade and the illegal trade, and both are extremely valuable. So Traffic, which is one of the main organisations that tracks illegal wildlife trade, estimates that the legal trade in wildlife products into the European Union alone is worth nearly 100 billion euros per annum. And the scale of the illegal trade is even more difficult to estimate because of its clandestine nature. But a range of different agencies value it as worth between 7 and 23 billion US dollars annually. So valuing the trade is really challenging because it's difficult often to separate out legal and illegal trades, and in particular species, and also because they're often deeply intertwined and the profiles of demand and supply can change very rapidly. But wildlife products, I think we can say, are part of our everyday lives. It's more than just ivory carvings and powdered rhino horn. You can see from these photographs kindly supplied by Meredith Gore that it can be everyday items like the stingray skin earrings that's on one picture, and then we have shoes, handbags, boots and jewelry in the other. So wildlife products are part of people's everyday lives as food, as clothing, as medicines, as curios, furniture, ornaments and jewelry. So rhino horn and pangolin scales are used in medicine, ivory for curios and ornaments, caviar in Europe is a luxury consumption product, birds of prey, both birds and eggs from Scandinavia are sent to the Gulf states for falconing, frogs and reptiles from Madagascar and Vietnam are in high demand as pets in Europe, or rosewood can be trafficked from Madagascar, which is highly prized for high-end furniture in China. And I imagine that if you looked around your house today, in your fridge or in your cupboards, or what you're wearing, you'll find a wildlife product of some kind. Mostly that will be legal, but some of it will be illegally sourced and transported, and you may not even know it. In fact, it's almost certain that you won't know it. But what this shows is that it's a global scale trade with global scale demand. It's not confined to Africa and Asia. And I really want to emphasize that, because I think a lot of debates about the illegal wildlife trade focus on Africa and Asia as the problems of production and consumption. But Europe, as I'll talk about in a moment as well, for example, is a key site of demand, of consumption, of production, and of transit of wildlife products. So the sheer scale of the trade, the value of it, coupled with very low penalties and low risks of being caught, mean that it's very attractive to criminal networks, of course. And there were concerns then expressed that including from UNODC and the World Customs Organization, the Global Environmental Facility, that it might fund and sustain criminal activity. But what we could see by about 2019 actually is that there was some good news around the slowing rates of poaching, and this graph shows the rates of poaching for rhinos in Africa from Save the Rhino, who do some terrific work collecting this kind of information. And it indicates a very steep rise from 2006 to 2015, and then a kind of an ongoing decline. I don't want to overstate the positivity of this decline, because that could be due to several factors. It could be due to demand reduction, it could be due to greater levels of enforcement on the ground, or it could be that accessible rhino populations have already been poached out, so there's just fewer rhinos to gain access to. But what we saw after this kind of initial sense of there were positive gains being had in the illegal wildlife trade space, the eruption of COVID-19 provided a new impetus to focus on the wider risks posed by the illegal wildlife trade. And most of you, I'm sure, will remember that right from the beginning, there were concerns that markets where different kinds of animals were kept in close proximity and in crowded conditions might lead to a context in which a virus could jump species. And the markets of Wuhan were identified as the probable source, with bats as the most likely origin of COVID-19. So conservation and animal welfare NGOs, amongst others, seized on the pandemic as evidence that there was a need to ban wildlife trade in all wildlife markets, whether legal and regulated or illegal and unregulated, and that to do so was to act in the interests of public health. So this again has kind of forged a new sense of urgency, I think, that lies behind the rise of security related approaches in tackling the illegal wildlife trade. And I think that this sort of urgency is based on the idea that we must act now because there are significant threats to both wildlife and to human health and well-being. So what happens if we define wildlife crime, if we define illegal wildlife trade as wildlife crime? So often illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime are used interchangeably in debates, but they're not quite the same thing. The shift towards illegal wildlife trade more broadly, seeing it as a form of wildlife crime and as a form of serious and organised crime, has presented conservationists with this kind of vexing question of what new approaches are then needed to prevent further wildlife losses. And the answer that emerged in the wake of the poaching crisis was a faith in security-oriented approaches. And this shift in thinking has been achieved firstly by redefining and elevating illegal wildlife trade from being a crime to being a form of serious crime. And secondly, by arguing that the trade can be a funding strategy for non-state armed groups, so militias, rebels, and even terrorist groups, and also that it's a funding strategy for organised crime networks, including mafia, Russian mafia, triads, amongst many others. So the sort of security-oriented response revolves around enhanced law enforcement, increased penalties, use of surveillance networks, and use of counterinsurgency tactics. And at the more extreme end and the use of force end of militarisation of conservation, which I'll talk about more fully in a few moments. So what's the problem then with defining illegal wildlife trade as a wildlife crime? And in the book, what I argue is that this creates very powerful omissions, actually. So tackling illegal wildlife trade only as a matter of crime and security offers very short-term solutions and creates this series of emissions. So I argue against seeing illegal wildlife trade only as a matter of crime, and instead argue that it's really important to also see it as part of or as driven by global inequalities, producing harms against people and wildlife and ecosystems. So if we see illegal wildlife trade only as a crime, that doesn't really address the longer term and underlying drivers of poaching and smuggling. And it moves conservation away from approaching illegal wildlife trade as the result of economic inequalities, social injustice, or the ongoing legacies of colonialism. And I think it's really important that policymakers are actually really mindful of how national parks, especially in Africa and in some parts of South Asia, have often been built on a history of very violent exclusion, dispossession, and also ongoing exclusion, but that they began in the colonial era with often violent dispossession. So some of the most famous national parks in the world, Serengeti, Masai Mara, Kruger, were created during the colonial era as wilderness spaces via the eviction and ongoing exclusion of African communities. And this isn't just a moment that happened in the past, it's current reality for communities that have been evicted from those areas. And I think that history can actually explain, in part, the ongoing resistance to them and helps us understand why illegal hunting of wildlife continues. And I think it's really important that we understand the history of the term poaching in this context as well. So sometimes if we think of European storytelling or European fairy tales, the figure of the poacher can often be seen as a sort of heroic resistor of landowners and nobility. But the sort of casting of poachers in the illegal wildlife trade is quite different. We need to understand how the term poaching has been applied to particular practices and communities, but not applied to others. So one simple definition of poaching is any hunting or removal of wildlife that's not sanctioned by the state or its private owner. It's important to distinguish between subsistence and commercial poaching and recognise that these two are imperfect and overlapping categories. So subsistence poachers broadly typically target smaller animals for food. They rely on low technology techniques like traps and snares, and they tend to have a much less significant impact on wildlife. Some forms of illegal hunting for meat straddles both subsistence and commercial scale activities as well. Commercial poaching can be, also current debates tend to be dominated by concerns about those who are defined as commercial poachers. And that form tends to be more organised, targets valuable species like tigers, pangolins, elephants, rhinos, and they may have more advanced technologies like GPS, automatic weapons, mobile phones, and so on. And they tend to have a much more significant impact on wildlife populations. And it's that form of poaching that's grabbed the headlines and grabbed the attention of policymakers. But the ways that we think about and define poaching is critically important. So I've juxtaposed these two pictures here because Frederick Courtenay Selous was very famous for being a big game hunter and bagging lots of wildlife as he acted as a colonial administrator and explorer in the 19th century. But his kind of activity is defined as very sporting, gentlemanly European sport hunter, whereas other kinds of hunting, African methods of hunting at the time, were criminalised as cruel and inhumane and unsporting. And so we really need to look back at that history of how the category of poacher in former African colonies was generated in the first place. And it was about excluding access for African communities in order to create access for European sport hunters to engage in wildlife hunting. So the way we think about poaching is really important, and the switch to describing the illegal wildlife trade as wildlife crime renders invisible this contextual politics of poaching, and it communicates the idea that perpetrators are criminals who knowingly and willingly engage in breaking the law for their own benefit, and that they have very little regard for wildlife or their impact on ecosystems, we quite often see in big conservation NGO campaigns like this one, Wildlife Conservation Society's 96 Elephants campaign, where poachers were described as cruel and inhumane and violent beings who cared little about wildlife. But this is a very partial view of poaching, which doesn't address how in some places colonialism created poaching as a category for illegal behaviour. And I think also the term wildlife crime also obscures the ways that people may be drawn into the poaching economy. They might become poachers to make ends meet as a result of the lack of other opportunities, or they may become poachers as a means of addressing relative inequalities, or even in some cases, individuals may have been coerced into poaching by more powerful people or networks in their societies. So a further problem is that focusing on security and crime makes it much harder to develop and support alternative livelihoods approaches that could be more effective in the longer term. It also diverts attention and resources away from focusing on demand reduction in wealthier communities around the world, because after all, poaching wouldn't really happen if there wasn't a demand for the products elsewhere. So I think it also underplays what Dan Van Oom calls green collar crime. And I've put up this slide of the current project, Beastly Business, where we focus on illegal wildlife trade in European species. And we use this idea of green collar crime, and those are environmental crimes committed knowingly or unknowingly by legal entities. And we're using this approach in the Beastly Business project on illegal wildlife trade in Europe to focus in on the trade in bears, eels and songbirds. And again, it's important to emphasise that in NGO campaigns in particular, but also in government and donor funding, as we'll see in a moment, Africa and Asia feature prominently as the problem in illegal wildlife trade, but Europe is a major site of production, consumption and transport of wildlife. And examples include caviar, glass eels, songbirds, wild garlic and timber, amongst many other products. So this way of thinking about the illegal wildlife trade as a wildlife crime has facilitated its redefinition as a security threat to governments and to global stability. And this then has shaped and been shaped by the shifts in funding available for tackling the illegal wildlife trade. So I'll use an example from the book to illustrate what I mean about funding patterns. So the redefinition of illegal wildlife trade as wildlife crime has produced these shifts in levels and types of funding made available for tackling the trade. And there's an element of opportunism at work here for both conservation and security sectors. Both are entrepreneurial. For the security sector, conservation provides new markets and new testing grounds. And for the conservation community, security brings important new streams of funding and a great deal of public attention as well, from policy commitments from some of the world's most powerful states. So you can see from this graph, these are figures from the Global Environmental Facility, and you can see that over the period 2010 to 2016, that the vast majority of funding made available for tackling illegal wildlife trade went to Africa, and then the second largest chunk went to Asia. And these trends are mirrored by other funders. So if we look at the UK's department, the UK's DEFRA figures, so this is the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. And what I did was an analysis of their projects. And at a later point, DEFRA did an analysis themselves of the projects, which confirmed the analysis that I had done around which organisations were benefiting most fully from the fund and which regions were also in receipt of most of the funding. So the UK government has committed to tackling the illegal wildlife trade through this challenge fund. It was established in 2013, and initially I was on its advisory board actually, and I found it a really fascinating space to understand how donors were tackling the illegal wildlife trade and how those debates were translating into policy. So by 2019, it had allocated 23 million to 75 projects. And the relative balance of projects was spread across 3 themes of sustainable livelihoods. That was 6 funded projects, strengthening law enforcement and the criminal justice system, which got 62 funded projects, and then demand reduction got just 7 projects. So the disparity is clear. Many more projects were funded that were associated with law enforcement and the criminal justice system than the other 2 priority areas of sustainable livelihoods and demand reduction. The geographical breakdown of funded projects also indicated that there were far more projects in Africa and Asia than other parts of the world. Now, I should say that the money was overseas development assistance money, so it was only for low-income countries. So Europe, North America, Middle East, and so on actually weren't eligible. But you can see that Asia and Africa, South America, and Central Asia got a much lower proportion of projects or amount of funding than Africa as a region and Asia as a region. And you can also see from the pie chart that Wildlife Conservation Society projects benefited substantially, as did Zoological Society of London and Flora and Fauna International. So one of the reasons that tackling illegal wildlife trade became such an important area for donor funding was because of this articulation of illegal wildlife trade as a wildlife crime and as a security threat. And these arguments about terrorism and illegal wildlife trade tap into a pre-existing and deep-seated fear about terrorism post 9/11. And since NGOs need to compete for funds, it makes financial sense to link conservation and security concerns together. For the screenshot that you can see on the slide is from Elephant Action League, now Earth League International, on what's now their quite infamous report on the links between Al-Shabaab and ivory trading, which they had to later on, following criticism of the figures in the report, had to say that yes, they had overestimated the link between Al-Shabaab and ivory trading at the time. So, but this was a very compelling narrative, and it meant that the report itself was taken up by global media organisations, by policymakers, by the US government as a reason for why they needed to invest more fully in tackling the illegal wildlife trade. But just to go back to this issue about how NGOs also articulated the illegal wildlife trade as a security threat in order to secure funding, one of the interviewees that I spoke to for the book said this. They were a US-based conservationist, and they said, the conservation community has not really expressed a whole lot of skepticism because it's driving money their way. This is a political economy of conservation. Bad news drives donations, so there's some manipulation of the truth in there too. And actually several of the other interviewees that I spoke to from conservation NGOs expressed a similar concern that they had felt pressured to make the link between illegal wildlife trade and organised crime, terrorism and armed groups in order to gain attention, in order to gain funding as well. But what does this translate into? And this is kind of my last point really, is that this enhanced funding that's primarily being made available for enhanced forms of law enforcement can actually end up being used to support wider forms of militarization in conservation. And the expansion of militarization of conservation, particularly in Africa, has generated concerns about human rights abuses, with several high-profile campaigns and reports. One's from Rainforest Foundation UK, which did a report on Congo Basin, and also NGOs campaigning on Indigenous rights and on human rights have raised important criticisms of militarization. So since 2015, Survival International has run a campaign entitled Stop the Con about abuses by conservation agencies in India, Cameroon and Central African Republic. Rainforest Foundation UK, as I said, has produced several reports of abuses of forest peoples in the Congo Basin at the hands of government conservation agencies, as well as conservation NGOs. And in March 2019, BuzzFeed published their now very well-known investigation. That's the panda logo there that's included on the screen, which is a well-known image now that went with the BuzzFeed investigation. But their investigation was based on a year-long study into human rights abuses by rangers employed or trained by Worldwide Fund for Nature in Chitwan National Park in Nepal and in Kaziranga National Park in India, and across several examples in Africa. And in drawing attention to these abuses in conservation, it's really important to see how the sort of harms and benefits of this kind of approach to tackling the illegal wildlife trade as a security threat are distributed very unevenly and can be implicated in producing injustices on the ground. So the human rights abuses that were detailed by Rainforest Foundation, Survival International and BuzzFeed include instances of torture, of rape and of extrajudicial killings. So to conclude, the rising rates of poaching of some of the world's most iconic species since 2008 catapulted the illegal wildlife trade to the forefront of global debates about biodiversity conservation and the effects of environmental damage. And when I first began working on conservation, or first began working on illegal wildlife trade 2 decades ago, it was actually very difficult to gain any kind of attention or any traction to this issue. It was that the sort of the big decision in 1989 to ban the ivory trade, which then in part resulted in a collapse in the ivory trade, kind of gave this sense that the illegal wildlife trade was solved, that there wasn't really a problem there anymore. And I actually found it very difficult to gain any interest to the research that I was doing. But all of that changed, I think, from about 2008. And I think the genuine concerns that poaching and trafficking could drive some species to extinction has combined powerfully with fears of governments, of donors and international organisations about threats to global stability. And in the arena of tackling the illegal wildlife trade, these threats are clearly presented as armed groups and organised crime networks. So as I said right at the start, placing this in the international context of donors and of funding reveals what's debated and decided at the international level is often led by mainstream conservation NGOs. And this is vitally important because there are power asymmetries involved in the funding that's being made available for tackling the illegal wildlife trade and the decisions over what kind of strategies to pursue. These power asymmetries really powerfully shape the everyday experiences of people engaged in both enforcement of conservation and those who live with the negative effects of that enforcement and of trafficking networks. So again, in another part of the book, I talk about how the role of the ranger has changed, and that for some rangers, that's that militarization or being involved in more forceful implementation of conservation initiatives is not what they joined up for. They were interested in the ecosystems, they were interested in the wildlife, or they were simply looking for gainful employment. But the shift towards security oriented approaches and greater use of force in some places is a switch for them, which they also want to resist as well. So this leads to a variety of outcomes, I think, including co-optation, enhanced surveillance and control of different peoples, exclusion, and ultimately at one end of the spectrum, the use of deadly violence against some communities to protect wildlife. But I think none of this really tackles the structural drivers of illegal wildlife trade or of biodiversity losses. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So the floor is open for questions. Feel free to either use the chat or raise your hand, and we'll be more than happy to share those questions with Rosaleen. I was curious, in your research, Rosaleen, you show the small percentage that's being used to fund sustainable livelihoods. Did you get, a better sense of who are the key players who are actually really engaged in that process, like one of those critical pillars of actually dealing with the problem as opposed to just militarizing it?
Do you mean in terms of pushing forward sustainable livelihoods?
Yeah.
So I think one of the difficulties is that you know, like with the DEFRA funding, the way it's set up, it's actually very difficult to show that the funding that you're applying for will have an impact within the time frame of the project. And so that means that those projects tend to lose out against those that are based on enforcement, because if it's about you know, we will increase the number of arrests or we will increase the number of seizures, those are metrics that play very well to donors, and they're metrics that can be shown within the time frame of a very short-term project. So I think that can really mean that sustainable livelihood type approaches can really they can be disadvantaged compared to other kinds of interventions as well. And I think as well the sort of big conservation NGOs are very prominent in shaping and defining what are the most appropriate, effective strategies for tackling the illegal wildlife trade. And for me, that's very problematic because, you know, they're part of a wider industry. And if they're all competing for funds, then it is within their interest to talk up illegal wildlife trade as a particular kind of threat. And I think we've seen that with the articulation of it as a security threat.
No, definitely. No, I think the research you've done and the book you've put together make that link incredibly clear. I know it's something in our own funding model at UNODC that can be very challenging. And like you said, you have these timeframes and these deliverables, and you kind of sometimes have to go for what's shiny.
Yes, I think
so
that's
to speak.
right. Yeah. And actually as well, demand reduction strategies suffer from the same problem because demand reduction can take decades to achieve. And so if you're applying for a 5-year project or a 2-year project, it's really difficult to show change in that space, in that length of time. And I think that's another reason why demand reduction tends to lose out against enforcement for global funding as well.
Definitely. I also find it extraordinary that 2 decades ago, nobody was paying attention. And I get that this was a strategy to bring the attention, and it definitely effectively worked. But it's such a shame that the issue itself couldn't be more prominent until this shift in thinking happened. Maybe you could tell us, I mean, when you did start and you were struggling to get funding, who were the people who were paying attention?
Yeah. So I mean, it was interesting. So I mean, I think, you know, in the sort of, I suppose in the sort of late 90s, early into the 2000s, the sort of big mainstream conservation NGOs, their core focus was on corporate partnerships, and it was on conservation, making conservation business friendly. And actually that's the research I was doing at the time as well, because all of my research has been about the politics of conservation. So there were these kinds of waves actually, which I talk about in the book. So we have the kind of fortress conservation era. Then in the 90s, there was the kind of everybody was interested in community-based natural resource management and participatory approaches of working with communities. And then that got overtaken again for another kind of 10-year period where the focus was, and still remains so in many ways, around corporate partnerships, making things business friendly, payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, market-based instruments, and gaining funding from big corporations. And that was where the strategy for funding and gaining attention lay. But then I think the rises in poaching from sort of 2008 onwards made this kind of, it was kind of a natural confluence, if you like. So there was this sense of urgency. And I think one of the things where conservation, illegal wildlife trade and poaching mirrors the security sector is this kind of sense of a crisis. So it's responding to a crisis, and what you need to respond to a crisis is quick interventions. And the security sector, I think, offered that. And I think as well, in the last chapter of the book, I trace the growing involvement of private military companies in conservation and acting as trainers and advisors. And that, I think, is in part driven by the sheer numbers of people who are demobilized from interventions led by the US in the Middle East. And so there are a lot of war veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who feel that their skills and abilities and knowledge are transferable into the conservation sector. And actually, for some of the private military companies that I spoke to, some of their representatives actually expressed real concern that there wasn't enough regulation of these companies, there wasn't enough oversight, and that they were just popping up all over the place and operating without oversight from either national governments or from their home governments. And so I think that was another kind of big shift as well, and that was again a part about a sort of a confluence of particular moments in history together: poaching increases, sense of urgency, and lots of demobilized veterans who needed to find new ways of living post interventions.
Fair enough. I'm also very curious by the fact that very little attention has been paid to Latin America.
Yes.
Because I mean, obviously they have an equal abundance of wildlife, I mean, different types of wildlife, but I just find it really interesting that very little is gone to fund projects in Latin America. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I think Latin America, like Europe, is overlooked as an area of concern. I mean, I do think that you see security-oriented approaches in tackling timber trafficking and also sort of animal trafficking in Latin America. I do think we do see a little bit of that. So, but what was interesting actually is that the people that I spoke to in regard to this, actually, they were activists who were helping local communities and indigenous communities use surveillance technologies like drones, for example, and camera traps to actually create databases of information to allow them to report infringements on their land and on their resources. So in a sense, the security oriented approach was being flipped and used in a different way amongst the organisations that I spoke to for the book anyway. So that for me was interesting, is that it was playing out in quite a different way in Latin America, but also that globally, in terms of donor funding and donor attention, Latin America and the Caribbean as well was losing out in terms of focus and of funding, and that the vast majority of interest was about Africa and Asia. So I think that is the case. And as you say, there's lots of really important wildlife that is threatened by trade in Latin America, but it doesn't get the same kinds of attention and levels of funding, I think.
No, absolutely. No. Well, colleagues, at the moment there are no more questions. So I think I'm going to end the session. Rosaleen, thank you so much. It's been so interesting.
No, thank you. And yeah, thanks for persisting with the organisational side. And if anyone has any questions later on, please feel free to email me or DM me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you again. And thank you, colleagues, for joining us.
Sure. Thank you. See you all.